Before we begin, a brief note to you, the listener. What you are about to hear is not a nostalgia piece, and it is not a manifesto. It is an investigation, a long one. A story about how music slowly slipped out of our hands and into our machines, not because anyone forced it there, but because each step felt easier than the last. This is a story about convenience disguised as progress, about how sound lost its weight, and about what that loss gave us in return. It is about inventors who wanted to solve technical problems, executives who wanted to protect empires, artists who wanted to be heard, and listeners who just wanted a song at the right moment. This is not a simple timeline of formats and platforms. It is an excavation of habits, of small choices repeated millions of times until they reshaped culture. As you listen, resist the urge to jump ahead to the present. The present only makes sense once you feel how strange and fragile each earlier moment actually was. Settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace, and listen, not just for what changed, but for what quietly stayed the same. When Napster died, a certain kind of listener assumed the story had ended. The icon vanished from the desktop. The familiar search box disappeared, and for a moment, it felt like the internet had been corrected back into its proper shape. That feeling mattered, because it revealed what the industry misunderstood. Napster was not a singular machine that could be switched off. Napster was a lesson. It taught ordinary people that recorded music was not inherently tied to a store, a shipping truck, a piece of plastic, or even a particular brand of software. It could be turned into a weightless set of numbers. Once you learned that, you do not unlearn it. You simply look for the next door. The next door was not one program, but a different logic. The legal victory over Napster was real, but it was like winning a battle against a city by capturing its town hall while the streets remained full. Napster had a center. It had a room you could raid, a handful of executives you could subpoena, a list you could demand. The new networks learned from that vulnerability and designed themselves around the absence of a throat to choke. They scattered the directory, they blurred the chain of responsibility, and they turned file sharing into something that resembled weather. Something you could complain about, try to predict, even try to mitigate, but not truly stop without changing the climate. What made the post-Napster era feel more chaotic was not just the number of alternatives, but the way the alternatives rewired the user experience. The clean illusion of a single community fractured into 1,000 small hazards. You could download a song that was mislabeled or incomplete, or a low-quality re-encode of a low-quality re-encode, a copy of a copy whose wounds had been reopened and stitched again until the sound itself carried scars. You could download the right song and still lose, because the file was a decoy that delivered not music, but noise or a lecture, or an error message masquerading as morality. And you could download the right song and still lose, because the file was a trap that delivered malware, the kind of invisible passenger that made the romance of free music feel suddenly expensive. The industry watched this ugliness and mistook it for a deterrent. In a narrow sense, it was. There were people who stopped because they were tired, because they were afraid, because they had been burned once and learned that free sometimes meant infected. But the larger effect was more corrosive. The ugliness did not restore faith in the old model. It simply lowered the listener's expectations for what the internet was allowed to be. A generation learned that the digital world was inherently hostile, full of pop-ups and viruses and broken promises, and that the price of access was constant vigilance. That lesson would linger, and later it would become a quiet selling point for the companies that offered the opposite feeling. Clean interfaces, one click, no fear, no uncertainty. The industry, in trying to make piracy unpleasant, accidentally described the shape of the product that would beat piracy. Underneath the mess, a deeper shift was happening, one that mattered more than any single software logo. The new logic of file sharing was collective. It did not treat a song as a singular object that moved from one owner to one borrower. It treated a file as something that could be broken into fragments and reassembled. A digital body whose organs could arrive from different donors and still form a living whole. That idea, once introduced, was devastating to centralized control. If a file lives in one place, you can destroy it. If a file lives in many places, you can harass it. If a file lives in pieces across thousands of machines, it becomes less like property and more like language, something that exists because people keep repeating it. This is why the industry's most aggressive instinct to soothe the user was emotionally satisfying and strategically disastrous. It felt like finally punishing the guilty. It felt like restoring order. It also converted the listener into an enemy. There are many ways to lose a public, but one of the fastest is to treat affection as criminality. The people being sued were not abstract pirates in an imagined foreign warehouse. They were the audience. They were the kids who bought concert tickets, the adults who bought box sets, the fans who filled arenas and wore shirts with band names like a declaration of identity. When those people received settlement letters that demanded thousands of dollars, the industry did not simply threaten them, it insulted them. It said, in effect, that your love is not welcome unless it is expressed through a register receipt. That resentment did not disappear when the lawsuit slowed. It became a cultural memory. It helped define the record labels as villains in the story the internet told about itself, a story where old gatekeepers tried to restrain a new freedom and looked monstrous doing it. And yet, even while the public mocked the lawsuits, there was a quieter truth beneath the outrage. People were not only stealing because they could, they were stealing because the legal market refused to meet them where they lived. The industry's early subscription experiments were not doomed by the concept of paying monthly. They were doomed by fear. They were designed by committees who believed that convenience was a dangerous gift, and that the customer, if not controlled, would inevitably betray you. So the services were built like prisons that charged rent. They required constant authorization. They limited burning. They limited transferring. They treated the act of listening as something that needed surveillance. Compared to that, the pirated MP3 was not just cheaper, it was friendlier. It did not ask permission. It did not expire. It did not remind you every time you press play that you were being watched. This is the vacuum that made the next phase inevitable. The winning solution was never going to be a moral lecture. It was going to be a product that made the illegal option feel like work. That is the most important principle of the modern music economy. People do not choose between right and wrong as often as they choose between friction and ease. The easiest path becomes the moral path by default, not because human beings are noble, but because human beings are tired. When Apple entered the story, it did not arrive as a savior of art. It arrived as an expert in fatigue. Apple understood that the user's greatest enemy was complexity. It understood that the person staring at a cluttered screen full of broken downloads was not thinking about copyright. They were thinking about time, about effort. about the small humiliations of technology that almost works. Apple's genius was not simply negotiating licenses, it was packaging relief, a store that behaved, files that downloaded without drama, a library that stayed organized if you treated it with minimal respect, and crucially, a device that made the computer feel less like a workstation and more like a companion. But the cultural pivot was not only the store and not only the device. It was the way the device was turned into a symbol. Before the iPod era, digital music hardware had been sold like calculators. Storage size, battery life, signal-to-noise ratio, ports, standards. The ads were full of specifications because the industry believed specifications were what made technology legitimate. Apple looked at those ads and saw a misunderstanding. Music was not primarily an engineering problem. Music was primarily a feeling, and feelings do not attach themselves to megabytes. So Apple sold absence. It sold silhouettes. In those ads, the person became a dark shape without biography. No obvious age, no obvious class, no obvious subculture. The identity was intentionally removed so that the viewer could slide themselves into the outline without resistance. The environment became pure color, an abstract stage where emotion was not explained but implied through motion. And in the center of this controlled emptiness, the only crisp details were the device and the white wires. The wires mattered because they were an inversion of what wires usually signal. Wires were supposed to mean clutter, technicality, constraint. Apple's wires meant membership. You could spot them across the street, across a train car, across a campus, and they told you that the person wearing them had crossed a threshold into a cleaner future. That transformation did something subtle to the ethics of paying for music. It made payment feel like participation rather than obedience. It reframed the act of buying a song as the act of building a personal world, a curated identity, a private archive you could scroll through as if you were flipping through the pages of yourself. The old record store model asked you to pay for a product. The iTunes and iPod model asked you to pay to become a certain kind of person. And people did. They bought songs with a kind of collector's pride, not because they suddenly respected the labels, but because the system made collecting feel elegant again. This is also where the walled garden became both a comfort and a trap. The lock-in was not only technical, though it was technical, it was psychological. If your library lived inside one ecosystem, it became a reason to remain, not because you loved the corporation, but because you loved the version of yourself that the library represented. You had invested time in your metadata. You had built playlists for drives and heartbreaks and parties that no longer existed. You had turned the act of listening into a map of memory. Switching platforms meant abandoning that map, and many people stayed not because they were forced, but because leaving felt like throwing away a diary. The irony is that this golden age of digital ownership carried within it the seed of the next revolution. Once music became numbers, it became transportable in ways that ownership could not fully contain. The store solved legality, but it did not solve abundance. It created new burdens. You still had to manage. You still had to sync. You still had to back up. You still had to worry about the moment when a hard drive failed and a decade of purchases vanished into a dead mechanism. Even when you paid, the responsibility of possession remained yours. Ownership is not just a right. It is also maintenance. A physical record could survive a power outage, A digital library could disappear because one small spinning disk decided it was tired. Streaming arrived as the promise of an adulthood without chores. It told the listener that they could stop being a librarian. It told them that their collection could be outsourced to the sky. It also quietly resolved the oldest tension in the music business, the gap between how people actually behave and how industries want them to behave. Most listeners do not love objects. They love access to emotion. They love the ability to press play and have the right song arrive without effort. Once the infrastructure became fast enough, once mobile networks became reliable enough, the idea of storing files began to feel like hoarding water in jars while a clean tap waited nearby. That tap had to feel instant because the listener's patience had been trained by decades of technology to shrink. The crucial engineering feat of early streaming was not only catalog size, it was latency. The difference between waiting 2 seconds and waiting 0 seconds is not just time, it is trust. If a song plays the moment you touch it, your brain accepts that the music is yours, even if it is not. It accepts the illusion of ownership without the burden of possession. That illusion is the foundation of streaming's dominance. It is why piracy began to feel like a hobby that required effort, while streaming felt like a utility you could forget was even there. And as listening shifted from desktops to pockets, the social role of music changed again. On a computer, listening often occupies the foreground. You sit, you search, you commit. On a phone, listening becomes a layer. It becomes something you do while living. The song is no longer the destination. It is the atmosphere. This is not a moral decline. It is an environmental change. A world of constant connectivity invites constant accompaniment. It makes silence feel optional, sometimes even suspicious. And platforms designed to maximize time spent learn to treat silence as a competitor. This is where the economic logic began to sculpt the art form more aggressively than any label executive ever could. The streaming model did not simply pay less per play. It paid in a way that encouraged different behavior. When the unit of value becomes a stream, and when the stream is counted only after a certain threshold, the song becomes a machine designed to survive that threshold. The listener might not consciously know the rule, but the industry feels it in its bones. A track that loses the listener early is not just unpopular, it is unpaid. So the music adapted. Intros shortened. Hooks arrived earlier. Choruses were dragged toward the front like a life-saving raft. The long, patient openings that defined so many older songs began to feel like luxuries reserved for artists who could afford indulgence. And even the length of songs changed, because when you are paid per stream rather than per minute, there is a quiet incentive to compress. A shorter song can be played more times. It can generate more counted moments per hour. It can fit more neatly into playlists designed for commuting, working, focusing, sleeping. When the platform becomes the primary venue, the platform's rhythms become the composer's invisible metronome. At the same time, the platform learned that the greatest threat to engagement was not boredom, but choice. A library of millions of songs is not a paradise. It is a paralysis. For a while, streaming services were essentially gigantic warehouses with a search bar. You had access to everything, and you still listened to the same 10 artists because habit is easier than exploration. The promise of infinite music was undermined by the reality of human attention. Most people do not want infinite options. They want the sensation of discovery without the labor of hunting. They want to be surprised safely. This is where recommendation became the platform's true product. The playlists were not just features. They were a new form of radio, but one that felt intimate, because it was built from your own behavior. When personalized weekly mixes arrived, they did more than solve discovery. They changed the psychological posture of listening. They taught the listener to lean back, to accept, to let the machine take the first step. That is a profound cultural shift. For most of recorded history, listening involved some kind of deliberate selection, even if it was just choosing which record to pull from a shelf. Now the selection could be outsourced. And once that outsourcing felt good, it became addictive, because it removed responsibility. If the playlist is bad, it is the machine's fault. If the playlist is good, it feels like fate. The more the machine recommended, the more it learned. And the more it learned, the more it reshaped the market. Because recommendation is not neutral, it is power. A song placed on a major playlist can become a career. A song ignored can vanish into the deepest part of the catalog, where only the most determined searchers will ever find it. This is how gatekeeping returned in a new costume. The old gatekeepers were radio programmers and label executives. The new gatekeeper is a system that does not speak, does not justify, does not apologize. It simply places some songs in front of you and leaves the rest behind a curtain of infinite scrolling. That gatekeeping also began to loosen the meaning of genre. Genres were once partly about communities, scenes, geography, history. They were ways of naming not just sounds, but identities. But an algorithm does not experience identity the way a person does. It experiences behavior. It learns that people who play one track often play another, and it links them, regardless of whether the tracks come from different traditions. In one sense, this is liberating. It allows listeners to move across boundaries without needing permission from cultural gatekeepers. In another sense, it turns genre into something softer, more functional, less tied to origin and more tied to mood. Rock becomes energy. Jazz becomes focus. Ambient becomes sleep. Music becomes categorized by use rather than meaning. The result is a world where sound increasingly behaves like a service. And that service model creates new kinds of music that are optimized not for attention, but for retention. If your goal is to keep someone listening while they work, the ideal song is not the one that forces them to stop and feel. The ideal song is the one that smooths itself into the background, present but not demanding. This is where the ghost artist phenomenon begins to feel less like a conspiracy and more like a predictable outcome. If the platform rewards utility, then utility will be manufactured. If the platform rewards anonymity, because anonymity removes distractions and reduces skipping, then anonymity will be cultivated. A generic artist name with no story becomes not a flaw, but a feature. Once that logic is accepted, the boundary between human and machine becomes less stable than we like to admit. Because if the primary goal of a large portion of streamed music is to function, then the craft shifts from expression to production. And production is the domain where automation thrives. The listener, meanwhile, sits in a strange position. They still want music to move them, but they also want it to behave like water. Always there, always clean, always instantly available. Those desires can coexist, but they tug in different directions. And the platform, built to maximize time and minimize friction, naturally drifts toward the version of music that causes the least interruption. This is why the conversation about authorship becomes so tense in the modern era. It is not only an argument about rights and royalties, though it is that. It is also an argument about what we think we are paying for. In the analog era, you paid for an object and received a piece of a person's labor. In the download era, you paid for a file and received a sense of possession. In the streaming era, you pay for access and receive a feeling of infinite availability. When music is framed as availability, the human story behind it becomes easier to ignore, and once it is ignored, it becomes easier to replace. And yet, even within this drift toward utility, human hunger remains stubborn. People still chase songs that feel like confessions. They still fall in love with voices that sound imperfect, with recordings that contain room noise, breath, friction, the evidence of bodies trying to translate emotion into vibration. The most revealing tension in modern music culture is not between analog and digital or legal and illegal. It is between the desire to be comforted and the desire to be changed. The platform is very good at comfort. Art, at its best, is change. The question that hangs over the entire evolution is whether a system optimized for comfort can reliably deliver change, or whether change will increasingly have to live in the margins, discovered by people willing to do the old work of listening with attention. So, if you are extending this story to reach its full weight, the missing material is not filler. It is the connective tissue that makes the transformations feel inevitable rather than episodic. The post-Napster era is not just a sequence of services. It is the era where the internet learned to behave like a marketplace, and where the marketplace learned that the product was not only songs, but psychological relief. The iTunes era is not just Apple's victory. It is the era where the listener learned to treat digital music as a collection worth curating, and where corporations learned that convenience could rehabilitate payment. The streaming era is not just Spotify's rise. It is the era where ownership became a burden, where the playlist became a new kind of radio, and where the invisible logic of counting, skipping, and recommending began to shape the very structure of the songs we write. If you want the narrative to land with the full force of a feature-length documentary, linger longer on the sensation of each transition. On the dread of the lawsuit letter arriving in the mail, heavy paper that makes a digital act feel suddenly physical. On the quiet pride of a carefully tagged library, the way a list of artists becomes a private museum of taste. On the strange intimacy of a recommendation that feels like mind reading, and the equally strange emptiness of realizing that mind reading is simply pattern recognition applied at scale. On the way, each new convenience solves a real problem, while also quietly rewriting what listeners expect from music, until the expectation is no longer that music will demand something from you, but that music will fit you perfectly, like clothing tailored by an invisible machine. That is the true through line. Not the file formats, not the lawsuits, not the brand wars. The through line is the gradual shift from music as something you approach to music as something that approaches you. And when music approaches you, always, instantly, predictively, the final question is no longer only what music is. The final question is what listening is, and whether we still recognize it when the world stops asking us to choose. We have now reached the end of this journey, but not its conclusion. Music did not stop evolving when the file disappeared into the cloud, and it will not stop evolving when algorithms learn to imitate feeling. What has changed is not our need for music, but the conditions under which we meet it. The question that remains is not whether technology will continue to reshape sound, because it will. The question is whether we will continue to recognize listening as an act that requires attention, curiosity, and sometimes discomfort. If this documentary gave you a new lens on songs you thought you already understood, or on platforms you use every day without thinking, then the work has done its job. If you want to support more projects like this, share it with someone who still cares about how culture is made, not just how fast it arrives. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the hidden histories behind the tools we take for granted. And most importantly, the next time a song comes on, stay with it a little longer than you normally would in a world of infinite music. Attention is the rarest thing we have left to give.